Yesterday, we had the amazing opportunity of giving a chat about building for wildfire resiliency at the Colorado Building Symposium. And it was an amazing opportunity. First off, we want to say thank you to Robbie Schwartz from Build Tank Inc. for putting all this event together. It was pretty amazing. And we decided to record our presentation because community plays such an important role when it comes to fire resiliency. So we want to have a way of making this information available for as many people as possible.
The houses that we build for fire resiliency here in Colorado, and we also prepare our site for fire resiliency. But imagine if your neighbor did the same thing, and then your neighbor's neighbor did the same thing. So in my opinion, it's very important that we spread this information so that we act as a whole in protection against fire. Please comment down below with any questions. Please like as well. The more we can make this information available for everybody, the more we can make this video grow, the more we can achieve that dream of everybody being fire resilient and then reducing the risk of all these tragedies that happen with fire. So with that, let's jump onto the presentation. I hope you enjoyed.
So again, we have a great set of presenters for you on this topic of fire resiliency in our building. We have Hector and Marcella, who are the owners of Los Efficient Build.
And efficient build.
And efficient. They respect construction and real estate investment company in the Rocky Mountains. They specialize in building high performance and fire resilient homes in climate zone 7 at altitudes over 8,000 feet. So we really appreciate you speaking with us, and take it away.
All right, so as Robbie mentioned, this is Marcela Average and Hector Average, and we're from Efficient Build. We build spec homes and do real estate investments in Boulder County and Dolby County. We love mountains, so we only build in the mountains. What makes us a little bit different from the typical builder is that we are self-funded in our loans, and so that means also no customers. In other words, we are the customer. Now that comes with a price. I mean, it's awesome to not have any customers, but the price is that we move very slowly because, well, the funding trickles out. So with that, let's get started. There you go. So this is the agenda that we're going to be discussing, and we have a lot of content, so I'm going to try to move as quickly and understandably as possible. So we're going to be discussing some basics on fire terms. We're going to be discussing a couple of active and passive approaches to protecting homes. We have some content on tax benefits that's provided by Colorado, and then hopefully we'll have enough time at the end for some questions and conclusions. If not, we're always available. All right, so what was the motivation for us to do this? It's effectively this video right here. This is not a wildfire situation, but that particular house, out of the many houses that are in this hurricane zone, managed to survive Category 5 hurricane. So this has sparked us to figure out, okay, how can we do this for our natural disaster here in Colorado? So basically, in all of the US, you have natural disasters like hurricanes in Florida, tornadoes in the Midwest, fires in Colorado, and, well, California, everything. So the key takeaways from this particular lessons is they interviewed the owners and builders of these particular houses. And basically the takeaway was, okay, we decided to plan ahead of time, be upfront with the fact that we live in a disaster area. We spoke with the engineer, we made sure that the house was structurally built correctly. We put the house on stilts so that the ocean flow could go under the house. And basically the takeaway from this is, if you plan ahead of time, if you think about your materials, if you think about your construction, you can hopefully survive disaster. And note on that, hopefully. Okay, before I jump any further, I'm going to mention a few key terms. So there's this term called Wildland Urban Interface, or WUI. Effectively, what that means is people have started building in areas that in our case are fire prone. And in this image is actually from Boulder. The blue dots are houses. The yellow, they're the WUI interfaces. So effectively, we're right in the middle of the wildfire zone. Um, let's look. Okay. So here in Colorado, there are about 2,500 wildfires that start, and about 50% of those wildfires they're initiated by lightning. So there's nothing we can do to prevent that, basically. So, and this is a big problem right now because in a world without humans, fire would start. It would effectively clean the area from brush, old trees, whatever, and then it would just grow again, and then you would have basically a single generation of trees. But with humans in the picture, we go into these areas, a fire starts, we go right away, we turn it off if possible, and effectively what we're doing is we're ending up with a bunch of generations of trees that are young, old, brush, dead trees. And so all of this is combustion for future fires, and that's why it's so difficult to prevent them once they get to stop them once they start. Cool. So next, the big takeaway also is here in Colorado and many areas like California, it is very difficult to get insured. And if you need to get insured, it's probably going to be very, very expensive. So that's a lot of money. So if you do the math, it's like, why don't I use that money to try to protect that house by making the house protected rather than pay somebody else that maybe will not even pay me full price if the house burns. So that's the biggest takeaway here. And then also build and go above and beyond on fire. But we'll be talking a lot more about this in the coming slides.
Alrighty, so before we start talking about how to prevent or fight fires, let's get into some basics on why houses catch on fire during wildfires. And the number one reason it's going to be embers. It's estimated that around 60% of the houses that are lost during a wildfire, it's because of embers. And what makes them so dangerous is that they can travel very far distances. The number I have here of 1 mile is the most conservative number I found, but if you start looking for other studies, you can find 5 miles, 10 miles, and I've seen up to 18 miles in the case of Australia fires. But the number is really irrelevant. What matters is that even if you see that the wildfire is far away, it doesn't mean that your house is going to be safe. And I'm hearing an echo. Does everybody else hear that too?
That might be coming from there. Oh, I think this one.
It's your fault. It's always his fault. Yeah. Okay. So, where were we? Okay. So the number is not really relevant. What matters is that even if the house is far away from the fire, it doesn't mean that it's safe. And I have a little note down there. If you cannot see it, it says numbers, numbers. Everyone has its own version. It's one thing that I have found when it comes to fire, since everything is so unique, you end up with all these numbers and variances. So for this presentation, we went with the most conservative ones that we had. Now, the other two reasons why houses catch on fire, one is direct flame, which is pretty self-explanatory, and the other one is radiant heat. And what happens with radiant heat is that you have this massive fire, it's extremely hot, and then the air comes in, catches all that heat, and then it pushes it against the structure. And what this is going to cause is now higher temperature on the structure itself, materials can crack, materials can melt, materials can fall down, and now, let's say if it's a window, you end up with a large opening where those dangerous embers can get into the structure. Or if, let's say, you have siding and it falls down, now you have combustible materials that are going to be exposed to the embers and the flame and the radiant heat. So those are the three situations why houses can catch on fire. And if we move into the basics, if we're going to fight fire, please let's take a moment to remember what is required. So to get fire, you need oxygen, heat, and fuel. And when these three come together, there's a chemical reaction, and boom, you get fire. So if we're going to fight it, we need to reduce or eliminate one or more of these components. Right. So with the basics out of the way, what can we actually do to start protecting a house from fire? And we're going to start with the home ignition zone. There are two parts to the home ignition zone. So one of them is the structural ignitability. This refers to the house itself, and this is where all these building materials come in. So we're going to cover that in a moment. The other part is the defensible space. And I like to think of this one as the site where you have the structure. It covers the perimeter up to 100 feet away. And what we're going to do here is trying to make the fire slow down and come to a complete stop before it reaches the structure. So how do we achieve this? I'm going to start from the far out coming into the structure. The first part is reduce the fuel. How do we do this? First thing, any dead trees need to go, period. The second part is we want to have the treetops at least 10 to 12 feet away. Now, by treetops, it could be a single tree, like between these two, or it can be a cluster of trees. So for example, these three count as one, these other three count as one. You want to have the spacing of 10 to 12 feet. And the way I recommend doing this is just go on the side, you take maybe 10 steps, stop, and look up. If you see that there's this natural distance of 10 to 12 feet, but there is maybe 1 or 2 or 3 skinny trees in the middle, you can take those out, and then you have broken that bridge for the fire. Now, those trees might still catch on fire, but it's going to be slower. So by the time it's getting here, it's not as intense as it was when it just entered the 100 feet line. That's the idea for the first 100 feet. The other thing we want to prevent is the ladder fires, which is what Hector was mentioning. In forest. You have the bush, and then you have a baby tree, and then you have a tall tree, and the fire is just coming from the ground and climbing. And next thing you know, there's a 40-foot tall tree covered in flames. So to prevent the ladder fire, if you have any shrubs close to trees, just remove them. The other thing is cut the branches from the trees at least the first 6 to 10 feet from the ground. So if there's a fire on the ground, it's not going to easily climb up. Now, if you say, I really love this bush that I have by my tree, okay, you can keep that. But if you do that, then instead of 6 to 10 feet, you might need to go maybe 8 to 14 feet to account for that bush. Now, if we have done this well, and if we have been lucky, with fires, there is no guarantee that anything is going to work, but if everything is going according to plan, when we enter zone 2, this is within 5 to 30 feet from the structure, we want to stop the fire. This is where we want it to come to a complete stop. So you can still have certain trees and plants in this area, but you have to be more selective, right? Keep it to very special trees. If you're going to have plants, have short plants, and keep distances between them. Also, you can have furniture in this area. Just be smart of what you put in there and keeping spaces so that the fire is not jumping from one place to the other as easily. Now, if we have done this all right, now the fire stops here. But remember that we still have those embers. So that's where zone 1 comes in, and it's potentially the most important one because the embers can come from very far away. So with zone 1, it's ember resistant. It means 0 combustibles. Plants, not allowed, neither dead or alive. Around the house, you want to have maybe a concrete pad or gravel or pavers, materials that are not going to ignite. The idea is that if an ember falls in, you laugh at it, say, there's nothing to burn here, and then it's going to die. That's the idea for zone 1. And that's how defensible space works. What I would mention is you can get this to perfection, and then you insert humans, and then they put the trash against the house. Or they do a great job in cleaning here, and they put the debris against the house. So if you're going to go through this trouble, make sure that you educate the homeowner on what maintenance is required. Is it effective? We have 2 examples here where defensible space probably made the biggest difference in saving the buildings. There are other things that seems to be stucco, that has a metal roof. There may be more elements, but defensible space can be one of the most effective ones. And it's relatively inexpensive. If you have a brand new construction, you already have the excavator on site, you have the machines, you just need to say, extend the clearing of the land for an extra 10 feet. It's going to be way cheaper than coming later and having to bring those machines in. Or alternatively, buy a chainsaw and then go and have your own defensible space. You can also do that. And I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. I have tax information at the end. For Colorado, if there is a tax benefit for the first $2,500 you spend in fire mitigation, and you claim it on your annual tax return. So it's pretty simple. So with that, we're going to move now on to materials and assemblies. Before I do that, any questions on defensible space?
Is there a different consideration given to an aspen tree than to a cypress tree?
Honestly, no. It's more, the difference between the trees is that, for example, the aspen kind of boils when it comes to fire, whereas other trees that have resins, they light up more easily. But at the end of the day, if you have the aspen tree, if it eventually catches on fire, you're going to have that radiant heat, and you're going to have more fuel for the fire.
In which zone should this firewood be stored?
Sorry, in what zone?
Which zone should firewood be stored?
Oh, firewood. Yes, at least on zone 2, nothing on zone 1. It can be on zone 2, but this is where common sense comes in, like store it as far away as possible, honestly. But zone 2, it's acceptable.
Or you can build a small container that's hopefully as fire retardant as possible.
What decks in zone 1?
What tax in zone 1? I would say that's going to be covered probably in materials and assemblies, where depending on the material that you have, if you use a lower category, then you need to kind of compensate for that vulnerability that you have. And Hector has also some information on that.
Is the zone measured from the deck or from the house?
I would say from the deck, because that's the area that you're trying to protect the fire from getting in. If you have the deck getting into zone 2, you still have fire there. That's where you want it to stop. All right. Okay, so let's move on to materials and assemblies. And I'll be honest, this one is intended to be a very high-level description of the materials, because we want to have more time for the actual action items that you can have and examples of measures you can take today for fire protection. So this is just going to cover the surface, just so that when you are selecting materials, you have some pointers into what you want to look at. So first off, how are these classifications given to materials? So let me introduce you to the Steiner tunnel, which is that device right there. The way this works is you put the material in this tunnel. It's about 25 feet long. You ignite the fire at the beginning, add some air, and then there's a person observing and measuring how is the flame spreading through that material. It runs from 10 minutes. At that point, the test stops. The observer takes some measurements. They do a bunch of math and calculations and formulas, and they come up with 2 numbers. One is called the FSI, flame spread index, and the other one is the smoke development index. If these 2 numbers fall within certain ranges, then the material gets assigned a category. And with that, we're going to move into the categories themselves. So for this one, please don't get caught up on these FSI and SDI numbers. I'll explain them in a moment. The main thing to remember is classes are like grade schools. A is the best you can get. B, better than some other options. C starts to get questionable. You want to stay with class A. This is where you have the non-combustible materials. They are not going to burn, and they are not going to add fuel to the fire. The classic examples, brick, concrete, gypsum, fiber cement, and even glass fall in here. With class B, we have combustible materials, but they burn slowly. Now, slowly is relative. Here we have some types of wood, like cedar or hemlock. or we can have some factory treated wood products. The keyword here is factory. Like if you get a piece of pine and apply a coating, that's not Class B. It has to come from the factory. And finally, we have Class C. So Class is pretty much all the other building materials we have, Douglas fir, pine, OSB, plywood, etc. So when I'm going to say stay away from Class C, framers don't panic, you can still frame with this. I'm talking about the exterior of the house, where if embers come in, this is going to be directly exposed. So that's in a nutshell. Now, why do I have these FSI and SDI numbers here? What I want you to notice, it's the range between them, not the numbers themselves. But in Class A, we go from 0 to 25. That's just 25 points in between. When you get into Class B, we now have 50 points range. And when you get into Class C, you have 125 points range. So a Class C material could be almost as good as cedar, or it can be half a point away from being non-rated. So the key thing here is whenever you see a fire classification, don't say like, oh, it's fire rated, it's good. Take a moment to go down and see what exactly does it mean. Okay. And there's always caveats. So fire rated doesn't mean it's good, right? It's like Jimmy coming from school and saying, I'm doing great at school. My teacher gave me a grade. He's like, well, I need to know more, right? Same thing here. There's a Class D. Look at the range. Now we have 300 points. Class E, 500 and above. This is pretty much non-rated. So is it fire rated? Yes. Is it good for fire resiliency? No. So pay attention to these items when you select materials. And the big one here, even when we say Class A, there are some caveats. So vinyl is the perfect example. It's Class A. It doesn't ignite, but it melts. So if you did your good work with the window, double pane, tempered, and you have a vinyl frame, if it melts down, the glass falls, and now the embers come in, right? So for references, I have melting points here. It's estimated that wildfire, the temperature can be anywhere between 800 Fahrenheit to 2000. So with vinyl melting at 200, 500, it doesn't stand much of a chance. If you upgrade that window frame, let's say to aluminum, you have a better chance, with 1200 or steel with 2500. So these are the things that you need to consider even if you see Class A. Always stop and think, how is this material going to perform in case of a fire? Okay? And one final note. You're also going to see there's Class 1, Class 2, Type 1, Type 2, and so many other letters. They are more or less the same when it comes to the material. What you need to remember, A letter is your friend, number 1 is your friend. B is your worst case, 2 is your worst case. And with that, I'm going to move now to the assemblies part, which is where we come into this fire rating of 1 hour, 2 hours, and so forth. So what is the difference? The thing is that here it's an assembly. We are rating a full wall or floor system or a ceiling or a roof versus one material on its own. That's the big difference. And what we're doing here is we are preventing the passage of heat, fire, smoke for a specific amount of time before active measures. That means before the sprinklers go off or the fire department shows up. And very important, it accounts for the structural integrity. It doesn't mean that it's not going to get damaged. It can, but it's not going to collapse so that residents have enough time to exit the building safely. So that's the big difference between when you see this rating in 1 hour, 2 hours, and so forth versus Class A, Class B, etc. With the caveat of roofs which get Class A, Class B, and Class C because there is a little bit more nuance to that. Okay, and with that, I'm going to hand it off to Hector for passive and active protection. Any questions at this point on what I just presented on materials? Yeah?
Do you have any idea at what temperature a fiberglass window frame would?
I don't. Do you know? Sorry, I don't. I'll add it to my homework.
It's about 1300.
1300? Also close to aluminum, more or less.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Cool. Anything else?
You were talking about Class D and being a certain material, like cedar as an example, but what about like heavy timber framing that has a certain thickness? Do you look at that any differently? Because I know in Boulder County, you're allowed to build decks with
Yeah.
nominal 2x framing as long as it's, I think, at least 10 inches deep, something like that. So I didn't know if you kind of looked at the char rating or
Yeah. The way I'm thinking about it is the material itself, if the flame is running through the surface, it's going to be about the same based on the Steiner tunnel because it is burning the surface. But it's true that it would probably withstand more time. So maybe the rating in the assembly would be different because you have a thicker piece of wood in there. That's just me machinating this in my mind. I would have to research an official answer. Yeah.
But the material itself is the same, whether it's 1 inch or 20 inches. So it will have its own rating if it's being graded.
Yeah, it would get the same rating, but maybe in the assembly it would get better. Okay.
Okay. Excellent. So now let's talk what I typically mentioned, what we consider active protection of a house versus dynamic or active protection. We will talk about dynamic protection here in a moment, but these are the simple things that we can do as builders, and that is the material selection for fire. So for example, here you can see we have a metal roof, or it can be slate, tile, any Class A material, and in my opinion, any Class A material that has a high melting point. Because roofs are very, very important. One of the first things to go in a house is the roof. If the roof goes, and everything goes. Gutters and vents are very important. It's very important to have gutters covered with metal meshes or gutters that are rated for fire, and it's very important to keep them clean as well. Then there's vents. They make fire vents that are against protection against fire. And we'll have a slide about that. So we'll let that be for the moment. Tempered glass on windows is very important because typically you might have embers show up and the heat itself is so hot that it blows the window open. And tempered glass is much better at resisting this. If that window goes, the house goes. Of course, the sidings, ideally non-combustible. I recommend like, for example, metal sidings, and you can make them, and they look like wood. In my opinion, these are very nice. They are very good against fire. I also like cementitious materials such as stucco, and that becomes important when we get to the dynamic protection or active protection of the house, because cementitious materials are absorbent. So that means you can spray them with water, and then they give you an additional protection. But we'll talk about them in a little while. Decks are super important that you cover them so that you don't get any embers coming down. Imagine when you go camping, you want to start a fire, although we don't do that much anymore. You put a bunch of sticks and then turn it on, right? So that's effectively what you're doing here if you don't cover it. And then, of course, defensible space. And then, ideally, some kind of metal flashing at the bottom of, so that way you have the entire house protected. So I believe Robbie mentioned that on his presentation. All of these acts as a system. No one single component will help you protect the house. They all act together, and details matter too. Okay. So here's a quick example from Wildfire. Here's where you have plants right next to the house. You have materials that are not maybe as well rated for fire. You have a wooden fence, and just notice how quickly this is going. Versus here, where you have a metal fence, so that fence is on Dutch, nothing's happening. You have maybe a fiber cement here. You have your okay. You have your defensible space right here with gravel. Okay. The roof is prepared.
So notice how the plants are still close to the house, but these are 4 feet away from the house, at least. And by the way, since we're building Boulder County, us, at least, we have to leave 4 feet of gravel all around the house. It doesn't have to be gravel, non-combustible materials. So, yeah. So now we also mentioned that we are high performance builders, right? So we talk a lot about insulation, thermal protection, and all that kind of stuff, not being airtight. So my thought process on this is, in my opinion, it's very important to use materials for more than one single thing. So you are using these materials for thermal protection, but you can also use them for fire protection. So in our case, and by the way, these are assembly, these are when we build our houses. There can be other assemblies. What we do is we have insulation coming in from the foundation. So the foundation is fully insulated around by 4 inches. So what we do is we put metal flashing to reduce the combustibility. Next, what we do is we have these things, they're called as figures. They are made out of fiberglass. They are incredible for the thermal, to prevent thermal bridging, but they are also incredible to prevent fires. These things don't burn, they don't melt, it's just like the windows. They can withstand a lot of heat.
What are they called? What are they called?
Figures,
These birds.
figures, I have it right there.
Okay.
Now, these particular ones I'm using, they have a little glass that you can insert something, and they will actually hold your insulation in place. With that,
Hector,
yeah,
can those Z-girts be installed vertically?
yes,
Yes.
yes. By the way, these sealers, they're typically used on commercial construction. I'm just bringing them onto residential construction. Okay, next, we are huge fans of mineral wool. Mineral wool might not be the top notch on our value, but it is the top notch against fire. So we want to use this mineral wool as our shield. So that's why we're putting it outside. And if you have noticed, we're doing exterior insulation. I'm a huge fan of exterior insulation. Yeah. Next, we have metal straps. If you look at the typical assembly of exterior insulation and mineral wool, they end up using wood fern strips. But after talking to a mineral wool manufacturer, they said, well, yeah, when we go to fires, the house is level, and then it turns out that we find all the mineral wool survived fine, but it's all on the ground. So from my perspective, it's very important to protect that assembly and to protect what's behind it. So we don't want that mineral wool falling off. The front, the siding can fall off, but we need to protect that OSB behind it because we know that's definitely going to go. So that's why I like steel straps. These are basically the ones that you use to strap framing, all that kind of stuff. Now we go to just the building side of things. Many people have mentioned it. Allowing things to dry. We use a rain screen. And then we come to the final side of the assembly. And like I mentioned, we like stucco, because it's a cementitious material. It can withstand fire. If you wet it, it can withstand probably even more because it will absorb the water. And then, of course, like I mentioned, there's all sorts of metal siding, like this one, or any of this. You can come check it out once we're done. And so that's the way we like to protect our assembly. All right, cool. So as I mentioned before, there are 2 critical points for a house to burn, I guess. The 2 weakest points, and that would be the roof, and that will be the interior. Now, the interior, I'm just going to leave it on the side, but the same techniques apply. If you choose proper materials for the interior, you can probably reduce the risk of fire from coming in from the inside. But we're talking about wildfire, right? So that typically comes from the outside. So the roof is very, very, very important.
Okay. So Marcela mentioned the Class A, Class B type ratings for roofs. These roofs are treated as an assembly, as she mentioned, so you can have lumber. But the key thing is that you need to, and these are rated in time. The key thing about time is, let's say you have a fire rated for 60 minutes. The 60 minutes is for the structure to not collapse, meaning the habitants can escape safely. But from our perspective, I think we can take it one step further and try to protect the structure as well. Okay. Like I said, details matter. For example, here you have these tiles, and you can see how they covered the front of the tile so that in case there's an ember, it doesn't go in there and sit and ignite whatever's underneath this roof, this tile roof, I guess. Also, like I said, gutters are super important. In my opinion, you shouldn't even have open gutters. They should all be covered, and you should maintain them properly and clean them up. All right, so that's it. These are our top priorities for passive or static protection of a house, effectively choosing the material, right? So we have gutters. Cover them properly with something that will not allow it to ignite. Vents are very important. I will talk about this in a moment. I mentioned decks. It's super important to cover them from underneath. I know a question came up for how to protect decks. Well, many houses are already built, right? So you're not going to be rebuilding a deck out of metal unless you have the budget, let's say. But for the most part, you might not do that, right? So what we end up doing for certain materials is that we use intumescent paint. What that means is when the fire shows up to the material, so that intumescent paint, you paint it onto the material, the fire shows up, and it basically expands like popcorn, protecting the material as much as it can. Will it be bulletproof? Probably not, but it's a risk reduction to the deck. And then finally, like Marcelo mentioned, we have the defensible space. Defensible space is very important. All right. So, like I promised, we have a pure slide on vents. So, when there's a fire, typically the embers are flying, and that's how the fire gets started. They enter the house, and that basically ignites something inside the house. You might be fully protected on the outside, but if you don't protect your vents, the house might be gone as well. So they make these fire protection vents. As you can see here, they have a honeycomb. That's equivalent to the intumescent paint. Basically, the heat comes in and the vents shut themselves to preventing any further fire from coming in. There are also other kinds of vents, like these baffle design vents. They are effectively a labyrinth for the embers. So the most likely scenario is that they're gonna get stuck in one of these little labyrinth things and not make it into the structure. In my opinion, a combination of both is even better. Now that said, they do reduce flow of air, so you just need to plan ahead for that. Cool. So let's talk about dynamic or active protection. The way I see dynamic or active protection is mainly for maybe new homes, or if you have a home already existing, you can probably buy sprinklers for the roof. That's effectively what active protection might mean, or as a whole. Sprinklers for the roof, for the walls, etc. It is much easier to implement on new homes. So, as an architect or as an owner, I think if you're in Colorado in the mountains or wherever, actually the grasses themselves are also very dangerous. I highly recommend implementing this. It does have a cost, but I think it's worth it. So now I will talk about all of this in a little bit more detail. So when you have sprinklers, we recommend that you have a tank or a pool pump, that you have indoor sprinklers. This came from talking to our local fire department. They said, "Oh, it would be amazing if your house had fire department connection, because that way, if a fire were to start, they can come to your property and set base camp there. And what better way to protect your home than having all the firefighters there in your property?" Cool. So let's jump onto this. This is an extension of what I was mentioning. So I have spoken about exterior sprinklers. The problem with a wildfire, and by the way, you might see on the news recently for California, they run out of water, and everybody's like super surprised. This is not new. This happens every single time. All the fire trucks, they come in, they plug in, and they're sucking out water, and then that basically saps the pressure on the water line. So for that, our recommendation is to add a tank on property, and it's exclusively designed for providing that water that you might lose when you lose pressure from the sea. But what happens when the fire starts? Excel Energy or whomever shuts off power. So if you get shut off power, then your pump is no good. So you need to have a backup for that pump, and that's why we recommend a backup power system. There are other tools that you can use. So, for example, the fire department, and then these things called that we call exploding balls. I have a slide on that coming up shortly. Okay, cool. So this is one of the setups. And by the way, these systems exist and companies exist that make what you see right here happen. So effectively, they are spraying the roof. That reduces the heat. That might also turn off some embers that might show up. It reduces relative humidity. As I mentioned, it's important to have a backup power setup. And then I have mentioned cementitious materials significantly, such as stucco. So this can also help prevent your that fire from breaking your assembly. And stucco is a great material for that kind of stuff. Now, these systems that they sell, they are smart systems. So effectively what they do is they are sensing the pressure from the city. As soon as you lose pressure from the city, they switch over to your personal tank. If you lost power, then you have your backup power, and that's how they distribute this water onto the different sprinklers going on.
Hector, is there a time frame before the fire reaches your house that you need to start wetting the structure?
I believe, that's true.
Yes. Yes. So it's not necessarily a time, it's more like the distance, because the time, it depends on the wind, how fast it's moving. So usually like 7 miles away is where you need to say, okay, there's a fire, I need to start preparing for this. The point is you want to get everything wet before the heat is in there. Pretty much that's the idea.
Okay. Yeah, so as I mentioned, everything that's happening in California, they lose water, they lose power. It's not a surprise. It happens all the time. So you gotta be prepared for that. And well, so here are the exploding balls. These are like more miscellaneous items. They're effectively these fire extinguisher, I guess, balls, firefighting balls that explode, and then they basically shut off or extinguish the fire. The way we think of using them is basically going back to the defensible space. You have your trees. In some of the properties we build, they're beautiful trees that you definitely don't want to cut off. So our thought process, at least, is to put these firefighting bolts, I guess. With that, I'll hand it over to Marcel.
Ask any questions.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
How would you use those exploding balls? Would you like mounted in a tree or?
Yeah, I think it would be more like Christmas tree ornaments. So the more you have, the better.
Yeah.
Any more questions? All right.
right. So is this on? Wait.
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So taxes. I know that everybody hates them, but here I'm going to tell you how to save some taxes or how to save some money. But first off, remember that this is for entertainment and educational purposes. So I'm not your tax advisor, and you cannot sue me for what I'm about to say. So if you go to the Colorado Department of Revenue website, there's a search box, and if you insert wildfire, the first result is going to take you to this page. I'm going to mention the first one just for your awareness. If you are rebuilding a house that burned in a disaster area, there is a tax benefit for that as long as the homeowner was underinsured. So let's say if the house they lost, the insurance is paying, let's say $500K, but rebuilding it, it's going to be $800. You qualify even if you build a house that is, let's say, $300,000. So just know that that this one is available. If you have questions, we can go over them, but it's very niche. So I'm going to talk about the second one. This one here is the one I mentioned, and it's going to be for the first $2,500 that a homeowner spends in fire mitigation, pretty much in defensible space. So you can spend more money, but the benefit is capped at the first $2,500. And the beauty is that you claim it on the annual tax return that you need to do anyway. There's just a section there that has the section for fire mitigation. You insert your information. You need to have your receipt. That's very important. If you want to do the work yourself, let's say if you buy the chainsaw qualifies for the deduction and the credit, but you cannot charge for the time you spent doing the defensible space. However, if I pay somebody to do it, then I can include it in that amount. So with that, there are obviously a few requirements. The property must be in the Wildland Urban Interface. It's only for individuals, meaning no LLCs, partnerships, corporations, etc. There are some exceptions, but you need to talk to your tax advisor for those. And very important, it must be for fire mitigation. So if I buy a chainsaw, that's good. If I buy trucks of gravel, that's good. If I pay an expensive architect to build a Japanese garden, then that's not going to apply for that. So, okay. And then one more thing. So the deduction applies to everyone. The credit, it's only when the income in the tax return is under $26,000. This is going to be updated. This is the amount from 2024. The amount for 2025 has not been disclosed yet. And if you want to read all the beautiful information for taxes, there is this document at the Department of Revenue website. It's a 6-page document with all the information that you might want to know, or even information you don't want to know, but it's still in there. Okay. And I don't intend to bore you to death with this. It's just to give you an example of how this works. So let's say if you have a person with $100,000 income, I'm using a fictional tax rate of 20% just for simplicity. They would have to pay $20,000 in taxes. Now, when you apply the deduction, it's going to be against the income. So $100K minus the deduction, then you apply the tax rate, and here they are saving $250 or about 10% of the expenses that they had. Now, I mentioned this is fictional, but it's realistic, so it's not that far off from this number. Now, the beautiful thing, if they qualify for the credit, you take this amount where you already saved money, and then you apply the credit against that amount. That's the difference between a deduction and a credit. The deduction reduces the income amount, whereas the credit, it's dollar for dollar against your taxes. So in this case, this person ends up saving $175, which is about 35% of the expenses. So if this is for your own house, well, you claim this. If you're doing this for somebody else, it's really the homeowner who is going to claim this deduction and this credit, but you can use it if you want to convince them about building defensible space. There's a benefit that it's available. Any questions on the tax stuff? No? Okay. Nobody's passionate about taxes like I am, but anyways, here we are for the conclusions. You can take the conclusions.
Okay. So we've spoken a lot about material selection and all that stuff. we're in a building science seminar. So as I mentioned, one very important takeaway is to try to choose materials that can serve you in multiple purposes, not single purpose material selection. And the one thing we've spoken, I don't know for how long, about fire, but the way I see this is for the people that have kids, you give your kids the best chance possible. You send them to the best school. You pay as much as possible to send to go to college. But is there a guarantee that they will succeed? Not necessarily, right? So it's the same thing with fire. We're doing the best possible thing we can to protect the home against fire, but there is no guarantee that it will succeed. So yeah, that's it. Coming up here, stick to Class A materials, but in my opinion, stick to high melting point Class A materials. Defensible space is one of the most affordable things you can do to protect your home or a home of a customer. So my suggestion is just do it. It's very, very, very important. It's actually one of the most important things that you can do. Roof, I mentioned roof. Actually, the two weakest ones of a house are the roof and the garage. I didn't mention the garage, but it's very important that you protect the roof as much as possible. And then, as we mentioned initially in the initial video, the guys that made all those changes to survive that hurricane level 5, they only spent about 20% more in improvements to make that house above the average code build. So it's not necessarily breaking the bank, and you can do multiple things. As I said, all of these that we're talking about acts as a system. No one single thing that you will do would be sufficient or might be sufficient to protect the house. And insurance. Who knows what will happen with insurance? They're gonna go maybe out of business.
Yes.
So why don't you just insure yourself, right? If you do get insurance, it's gonna cost a ton of money. And with that money, maybe you can build something better for that particular activity. Yeah, so that's our presentation for today. You can follow us on YouTube. We have our YouTube channel. A lot of what we talk about, we make videos on the different assemblies, how we do it, how we protect it, how we use intumescent paint, mineral wool, siding, etc. We have Instagram right there. We have TikTok, maybe until Sunday. We do it. And, yeah, so that's basically the representation. I know we'll open it for some questions.
Do you know if there's any like tax credits or anything for builders who are putting in sprinkler systems or use concrete materials or like any of that kind of stuff?
No.
No. Okay, that's my thinking.
And I mean, like, I haven't seen anything. I looked for tax benefits in general, and the only ones I found were the ones for the homeowners. It would be cool to have them. I think that they should exist because precisely what we're saying, firefighters cannot put out these fires. So let's help people get their houses become more fire resilient. So I say let's write letters to those government officials, and at least they get annoyed at some point.
So, yeah. Whatever. I'm pretty low. So there is a movement right now because the state, what is it? The state is getting ready to have a mandatory statewide wildfire code, right? And so the Colorado Wildfire Resiliency Board, say that's really fast. The state Wildfire Resiliency Board or something like that. Yeah, Wildfire Code Resiliency Board. They are put out a big, huge effort to see if there's a draft out of this new mandatory wildfire code that the state has, and they really want everybody's input. Today was the stakeholder meeting for government officials, but next Friday is the meeting for structure-related industries and professions, which I think is everybody in this room. So if you want information on how to attend that and how to say so in that state wildfire code that's coming out, that's going to be mandated, holler and I'll send you the information.
Was that ICC 605?
No, this is, I don't think so. I don't know.
Also, I was informed this morning that CBS News reached out to Boulder County, and Boulder County got people in touch with 475 who showed them some of the after effects of fire prevention from building passive house or doing some of these other techniques of hardening your shell and limiting ventilated roofs. And so there was that story last night.
Yes,
on CBS News.
this morning, I think it aired.
This morning it aired, so you can go to CBS News and see that story, and it featured Johnny is it Reyes?
Rosvani.
Rezani.
Right.
Johnny from 475, who's very active in the Power of Green Building Guild and whatnot, featured him as the spokesperson for some of these techniques that we were talking about. Are there any other? Here we go.
What about the bottom of your rain screen? You guys have a good technique to protect that. And just is to steel mesh.
Yeah, so we use bug mesh, so that will most likely melt. But what matters is what's also behind the structure. So we're leaving that little gap. I think it's about 1 inch. And so if you look into that opening, you will have that rock wall, mirror wall above, and then we end up flashing, going up the wall a little bit with that flashing. But in that case, it's aluminum, but it could be steel or any other one. So you have steel, the mineral wall, you have your gap, and that gap is protected with the boat mesh that's not really doing that much for the fire assembly, but we have all the penetrations, if you will, around that whole
And you just made me think of something else, another critical area to protect. And we don't think that much about it because I think that by code it has to be that way. But the first 6 inches of the house where it meets the ground, that's also where embers accumulate and debris accumulate. So you need to make sure that that area is definitely covered by something that is not combustible.
Can you talk a little bit more about the intermittent venting product and applicable to the home?
Applicable to
existing homes. Yes.
Verify venting with all neighbors.
you take it? Yes. So this one here, it's called paint, but if you can see, it's really like a liquid. It's very transparent and light to apply. The only thing with this one is it has to be a material that absorbs the liquid here. So if you have, let's say, one of the panels with the water resistive barrier, it would not go in. So it applies only to certain materials, but it's extremely effective. I don't remember what's the active ingredient. I want to say it's like the materials that we make pencils with. It's one of those chemicals. But the point is it expands up to 60 times. So it's going to create a very good shield. Sorry, Robbie.
I think he was actually asking about venting, the vent that.
The vent.
Sorry, my hearing is not the best, so take it.
Yes, the vent that we showed you is from a particular brand. I'll just mention it because I don't know of a different brand. The name is Vulcan Vent. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure if it's intumescent paint that they are actually using inside. They might be using some other chemical structure, but it has like intumescent paint, so that's why I mentioned it that way. I think that might be proprietary, but there are amazing vents, particularly for fire protection.
That take the place of a roof, keep a solid vent and
Yes.
in addition to the solid vent on the back of the pipe.
Yes, I think they make all sorts of vents for soffits, intakes, all that kind of stuff. So it's more.
They came out for the Marshall Fire when and did a lot of demonstration and whatnot. They don't happen to make a cover for vents, and I was actually going to ask a question about that because especially on the intake, The vent, generally it's recommended that you either use like a Vulcan vent or 1/8-inch screening. So that, because the ember size, if it's 1/4 inch or bigger, it can hold that energy for long periods of time. So that 1/8-inch size is important. But I'm wondering if you go to 1/8-inch screening on an intake, like a HRV or ERV intake, does that impact your flow and your performance of your ERV and HRV as well?
Yes, it does. So the way we assemble these vents is effectively we have the vent next to the OSB. You notice that we have extra insulation. So we leave a much bigger opening around that vent from the mineral wall, and then we protect that with metal, and that's effectively our greater vent to allow the greater intake from it. As far as covers, I think they end up being more aesthetic. So as long as it's, in my opinion, as long as it's a Class A with a good material, I think that's a better option.
Yes, and I mentioned one more thing. I'm glad that you asked that. So the ember-resistant vents, if you look at the specs, they say that they are not designed for example, dryers where there's actually flow going in. It's more like for like soffits and things like that. In terms of sizing, they do sell some that are specific for soffit venting, but they also sell this kind of mesh that has the intumescent paint, that honeycomb. They sell it, I think, by the roll, so that you can, if you have a weird kind of vent, you can also cut it to size and cover it that way. And I should mention that I know of 3 brands. One is Vulcan. I think the other one is called Ember South, but don't quote me on that. And there's a third one, which is this baffle design that I cannot remember the name, but it exists. So if you Google for ember-resistant vents, they are going to come up.
Yeah, we saw these guys as the irritable bowel syndrome.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
good condition.
And by the way, the one that we saw, it has the labyrinth, but at the end it has like a very thin strip of intumescent paint. So even if the ember makes it all the way here, there's still a line of defense at the end. Any more questions? Or Lisa, what's up?
Well, I saw that I build a lot with masonry, and so I tell the little big story a lot, and so I'm just wondering to this audience, like when we think some of the changes will be, when we're going to be perhaps looking at masonry again, or building complexity, and if some of the insurance can make pushing that direction. Not you have not because we can't answer.
Yeah, so the simple answer is no. But what I can tell you is we are builders, we don't necessarily design stuff. So anytime I go to the engineer and say, okay, I want to do a monopoly frame, he's like, oh, no. So the US way of building is a stick framing. And if I go to the engineer and say, I want a masonry house, he's either going to cost me a lot of money or he's going to be like, find yourself somebody else. So that's effectively where the friction might be. Now, that said, I believe stick framing is a great way of doing things because we do have an asset. I have lived in Mexico and everything is built in masonry. And once you have the scale of furniture, then, whoa, they're not moving. So what makes American house design building so great is the fact that it's so adaptable to changes. You can add additions, you can add new lights. So the long answer to that is I don't know.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.